At around 2 in the morning local time on January 3rd, residents of Caracas woke up to explosions rolling across the city and the distinct sound of aircraft flying low overhead. Within hours, the President of the United States had posted images on social media showing American troops escorting a head of state into custody, a man who just hours earlier had been running an entire country, now bound for a federal courtroom in New York. That operation, codenamed Absolute Resolve, ended up being one of the most complex, most carefully rehearsed special operations missions in recent American military history, and it fundamentally reshaped the relationship between Washington and Caracas in the space of a single night. Let's walk through exactly how this operation actually came together, what really happened on the ground during those critical hours, and why the single mission has already become a template the Trump administration keeps returning to again and again across multiple different theaters since. If you want the full, accurate account instead of just the dramatic headline, stick with this one all the way through. If it's useful, go ahead and subscribe, drop a comment with your take once we get through it, and let's get into it. It's worth setting the stakes clearly before diving into the details, because this wasn't a routine special operations raid against a militant camp or a hidden weapons cache. This was an American military operation aimed directly at the sitting head of state of a sovereign nation, someone who had been running Venezuela for well over a decade, and the fact that it succeeded with the kind of precision and speed it actually did tells you an enormous amount about how modern intelligence, aviation, and special operations capabilities have converged into something genuinely unprecedented. To understand why this operation happened at all, you have to go back years before the actual raid, because Nicolás Maduro's legal troubles with the United States didn't start the week he got captured. They'd been building since 2020. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York had already charged Maduro with narcotics terrorism, accusing him of partnering directly with a Colombian rebel group, specifically to flood the United States with cocaine, using the machinery of the Venezuelan state itself to facilitate that trafficking. That indictment sat largely dormant for years, the kind of charge that exists on paper without any realistic near-term path toward an actual arrest, given that its target remained comfortably in power, protected by his own country's military and security apparatus. What changed everything was a formal designation the Trump administration made in November of 2025, an unprecedented move declaring Maduro himself the head of a foreign terrorist organization, explicitly citing his alleged links to drug cartels, a claim Maduro denied. That specific designation deserves closer attention, because it functioned as far more than a symbolic diplomatic gesture. Formally labeling a sitting foreign head of state as the leader of a terrorist organization carries genuine legal weight under American law, opening up categories of military and intelligence action that simply aren't available against an ordinary foreign government official, however corrupt or adversarial that official might otherwise be considered. Once that designation was in place, Maduro effectively existed in a completely different legal and operational category than a typical foreign leader Washington happened to have serious disagreements with, placing him instead alongside recognized terrorist figures who have historically been subject to targeted military operations, extraordinary rendition, and direct kinetic action, regardless of where in the world they happened to be hiding. That designation placed the sitting president of Venezuela on the exact same formal list as terrorist networks like Al-Qaeda and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. An extraordinary diplomatic and legal step that essentially reframed the entire relationship between the two countries, no longer treating Maduro as a foreign head of state with whom Washington disagreed, but as a terrorist target subject to exactly the kind of military and intelligence operations that designation typically authorizes. Secretary of State Marco Rubio underscored just how seriously the administration was taking that designation the following August, announcing that the reward for information leading to Maduro's arrest had been increased from $25 million all the way up to $50 million. The actual planning for what would become Operation Absolute Resolve stretched back months before the raid itself, and understanding just how patient and methodical that preparation actually was helps explain why the operation ultimately succeeded with such precision. According to reporting on the mission's background, the operation had reportedly been ready to execute since as early as December of 2025, meaning the actual window between full readiness and execution stretched across weeks of waiting for the right conditions to align. The Central Intelligence Agency sent a dedicated team into Venezuela specifically to begin tracking Maduro's movements, relying on a source close to the Venezuelan president himself to build what military planners call a pattern of life, a detailed, continuously updated picture of exactly where a target tends to be at any given time, how they move, who accompanies them, and when their security posture might be most vulnerable. Building that kind of intelligence picture on a sitting head of state, someone surrounded by an entire national security apparatus specifically designed to protect him, represents an extraordinary intelligence achievement on its own, one that clearly required months of patient, quiet work well before a single helicopter ever took off. That kind of pattern of life intelligence work deserves genuine appreciation as its own distinct discipline, separate from the actual military execution that followed it. Building a reliable, continuously updated picture of a target's daily movements requires far more than a single well-placed informant. It typically involves cross-referencing human intelligence with satellite imagery, communications intercepts, and behavioral analysis stretching across weeks or months, specifically to identify recurring patterns, predictable windows of vulnerability, and the kind of security gaps that a target's own protective detail may not even fully realize exist. Doing that against an ordinary individual is already a significant intelligence achievement. Doing it against the sitting head of state of an entire country, someone whose security apparatus exists specifically to prevent exactly this kind of targeting, represents an entirely different order of difficulty. And the fact that American intelligence agencies pulled it off without any apparent leak or compromise over a period of months speaks to a level of operational discipline that's genuinely rare, even by the standards of high-end special operations planning. There's a genuinely fascinating diplomatic thread running underneath all of that intelligence preparation too, one that suggests this operation wasn't purely a story of American forces acting entirely alone against a unified, fully cohesive Venezuelan government. According to reporting from The Guardian, citing anonymous sources, Delcy Rodriguez and Jorge Rodriguez, both senior Venezuelan officials, had reportedly been in quiet communication with American and Qatari officials in the lead-up to the operation. American officials told reporters that Delcy Rodriguez had specifically indicated in December that Maduro needed to go, adding that she would work with whatever the aftermath actually looked like. That's a remarkable detail, if accurate, suggesting that at least some senior figures within Maduro's own government had effectively made their peace with the idea of his removal, whether out of genuine conviction that the country needed a change in leadership or out of a more calculated bet about their own political survival once the operation had actually run its course. There's a broader lesson embedded in that specific detail about how authoritarian governments actually function under sustained external pressure, even when they present an image of complete unity to the outside world. Regimes built around a single dominant figure often contain far more internal fracture and self-interested calculation among senior officials than their public messaging ever reveals. And those fractures tend to widen considerably once a genuinely credible external threat, in this case a $50 million bounty and a formal terrorist designation from the world's most powerful military, starts to make continued loyalty look like a losing bet rather than a safe one. Whether the Rodriguez siblings' reported contact with American and Qatari officials reflected genuine ideological conviction or simple cold political calculation about which side was more likely to still be standing after the dust settled, it illustrates exactly the kind of internal erosion that sustained, credible, external pressure can produce inside even a seemingly stable authoritarian system. Either way, it complicates the simple picture of a unified Venezuelan state resisting an outside American intervention, hinting instead at real fractures within Maduro's own inner circle that may have made the entire operation considerably easier to plan and execute than it would have been against a genuinely unified, fully loyal command structure. The actual order to proceed came late on the night of January 2nd. According to Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Dan Kane, President Trump gave the final authorization at 23:46 Venezuelan time, 22:46 Eastern Standard Time, setting the entire operation into motion. One detail here is worth flagging directly because it reflects a genuinely significant procedural choice. The administration did not notify Congress in advance of the strikes, citing specific concerns that doing so could have endangered the mission itself. That's a real and consequential decision with implications well beyond this single operation, bypassing the normal congressional notification procedures that typically accompany major military action, a choice that's likely to remain a point of ongoing debate regardless of how successful the operation itself turned out to be. Once that order went out, the sheer scale of the aviation effort involved in actually executing the mission becomes genuinely staggering to properly account for. General Kane later confirmed that, over the course of the night, aircraft began launching from 20 different bases spread across land and sea throughout the entire Western Hemisphere, ultimately involving more than 150 separate aircraft in a single, tightly coordinated operation. That air campaign served multiple distinct purposes simultaneously: suppressing Venezuelan air defenses across the northern part of the country to guarantee safe passage for the actual extraction force, providing electronic jamming and surveillance coverage, and maintaining fighter cover in case Venezuelan forces attempted any kind of aerial response. Open-source intelligence trackers even spotted an American RQ-170 stealth drone returning to Puerto Rico the following morning, extremely rare footage of an aircraft that almost never gets photographed, offering a small but genuinely telling glimpse into just how much sophisticated, normally invisible technology had been quietly deployed in support of this single mission. It's worth appreciating just how difficult it is to coordinate an operation involving that many separate aircraft launching from that many different locations without a single element of the plan slipping or colliding with another. Every one of those 150 aircraft had its own specific role, timing window, and flight path, all of which had to interlock perfectly with every other element of the operation. The jamming aircraft needed to be in position before the assault helicopters crossed into contested airspace. The fighter cover needed to be ready to respond instantly if Venezuelan forces attempted any kind of aerial intercept, and the surveillance platforms needed to maintain continuous coverage of the target area throughout the entire window of vulnerability. Coordinating that many moving pieces across a single night, launched from 20 physically separate locations spanning the entire Western Hemisphere, represents an air campaign management challenge, on par with far larger, more publicly discussed military operations, executed here in service of capturing a single individual, rather than any kind of broader territorial or strategic objective. The ground portion of the operation, the actual extraction itself, was built around a rotary wing interdiction force specifically trained and rehearsed for exactly this kind of high-stakes, time-critical raid. Helicopters carrying the assault force, reportedly built around Delta Force operators inserted by the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, approached Caracas at roughly 100 feet above the surface of the ocean, an extremely low-altitude flight profile specifically chosen to avoid radar detection for as long as possible before reaching the target area. More than 200 American Special Operations forces ultimately took part in the mission on the ground, according to subsequent CSIS analysis of the operation, executing what analysts would later describe as a genuinely surgical strike rather than anything resembling indiscriminate force. One detail adds a real layer of difficulty to the entire mission that's worth appreciating specifically. The raid had to be conducted during a full moon, a lighting condition that makes it considerably harder for an infiltrating force to remain undetected during exactly the kind of low-altitude, close-quarters approach this mission required. And yet, American planners still managed to achieve what analysts described as complete surprise, despite that added challenge. What happened once that assault force actually reached Maduro's compound reflects months of exhaustive rehearsal paying off in real time. Reporting on the operation described special forces breaching the perimeter, neutralizing key defensive positions, and reaching the target bedroom precisely on schedule, having reportedly rehearsed breaching that exact same door countless times during training beforehand, to the point that the operators reportedly knew the internal layout of the building as well as, or better than, Maduro's own personal guards did. That level of rehearsal fidelity, training against a physical mock-up, detailed enough to match the real target's layout with that degree of precision, represents exactly the kind of preparation that separates a mission that succeeds cleanly from one that devolves into exactly the kind of prolonged, chaotic firefight special operations planners work so hard to avoid. The mission wasn't entirely bloodless, and it's worth being honest about that, rather than glossing over it in favor of a purely triumphant narrative. According to General Kane's own account, the helicopters came under fire upon arrival in the target area, and American forces responded with what Kane described as overwhelming force in self-defense. One American aircraft was hit during that exchange but remained flyable throughout the remainder of the mission, and while no American personnel were killed, 7 U.S. soldiers were injured during the operation, a detail significant enough that some assessments have described the entire episode as bordering on an actual military conflict rather than a purely clean, uncontested raid, given that brief window of exchanged fire. Every single American aircraft involved in the mission ultimately made it back safely, an outcome Trump himself specifically emphasized afterward, and that damaged helicopter completing the rest of its mission profile, while still carrying battle damage, speaks to both the resilience of the aircraft involved and the skill of the crews flying them under real live fire conditions rather than a training simulation. Once the assault force actually secured the target, the confrontation itself resolved with less drama than the build-up to that moment might have suggested. According to Kane's account, Maduro and his wife ultimately gave up and were taken into custody by Department of Justice personnel embedded with the operation, with no further loss of life on either side during that final phase. The extraction force then began preparing for departure, and the entire operation concluded at 3:29 in the morning local time, when the force was confirmed safely back out over the water, having successfully completed the raid, secured its target, and begun the journey home in a total window of roughly 2 hours and 28 minutes from the operation's opening strikes to its conclusion. An extraordinarily short timeline for a mission of this complexity and this level of strategic significance. It's worth spending real time on exactly how the American air campaign that opened the operation was actually conducted, because subsequent analysis revealed something genuinely important about the character of this specific strike that distinguishes it from a broader, indiscriminate bombing campaign. Satellite imagery analysis conducted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies specifically examined damage at Fort Tiuna, Venezuela's largest military complex, and found that the destruction there was tightly focused rather than widespread, with no evidence of broad strikes against barracks, training facilities, or administrative headquarters buildings across the base. Instead, the damage was concentrated in several discrete, specific areas, most heavily at a motor vehicle, maintenance and storage facility that analysts believed was likely supporting a mechanized unit, exactly the kind of asset that could have been mobilized to interfere with the extraction operation if it had remained intact and operational. CSIS's own assessment described this as a deliberate effort to isolate and neutralize the specific capabilities most directly tied to rapid response and regime protection, rather than any kind of broader punitive bombing campaign against Venezuela's military as a whole. That distinction matters enormously for understanding the actual character of this operation. This wasn't shock and awe in the traditional sense of that phrase. Overwhelming broad-based destruction meant to demoralize an entire population or military. It was a precisely calibrated strike specifically designed to remove the exact assets that could have complicated the extraction mission, while leaving the rest of the country's military infrastructure largely untouched. That level of restraint is worth comparing against how a less disciplined military campaign might have approached the exact same objective. A less carefully planned raid against a sitting head of state might have defaulted toward overwhelming, broad-spectrum bombardment, specifically to guarantee suppression of any possible resistance, accepting significant collateral damage and civilian disruption as an acceptable cost of ensuring mission success. The CSIS analysis of Fort Tiuna specifically shows the opposite approach in practice. American planners identified the precise, narrow set of capabilities that actually posed a risk to the extraction force, a mechanized unit's vehicle maintenance facility specifically, and struck exactly that target while leaving barracks, training areas, and administrative buildings across the same sprawling complex completely untouched. That kind of targeted restraint requires a level of confidence in your own intelligence picture that few militaries could actually claim to possess with any real assurance, knowing precisely which specific buildings within an enormous military complex actually posed a genuine operational threat, and which ones simply didn't matter for the mission at hand. Once Maduro and his wife were actually secured, the logistics of getting them out of the country and into American custody moved with remarkable speed. The pair were initially taken aboard the USS Iwo Jima, then transferred to the American detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. From there, they were flown aboard a Department of Justice Boeing 757, directly to Stewart International Airport in New York, landing at 4:32 in the afternoon, local time that same Saturday, January 3rd. A remarkably fast turnaround from a pre-dawn raid in a South American capital to a landing on American soil, all within a single day. Both Maduro and his wife are set to face trial in the Southern District of New York, the exact same federal court district that had originally filed the narcotics terrorism charges against Maduro years earlier, finally giving that long-dormant indictment an actual defendant to prosecute. There's a small but genuinely human detail from General Kane's briefing worth including here, because it grounds this entire extraordinary operation in the reality of the actual people who carried it out. Kane noted that the youngest crew member involved in the mission was 20 years old, and the oldest was 49, a reminder that behind the sweeping scale of 150 aircraft and 20 launch sites and months of CIA tradecraft, this was ultimately executed by individual American service members, some barely out of their teenage years, carrying out one of the most consequential military operations of the entire year. The reaction to the operation split almost immediately along predictable but genuinely significant lines. Republicans in Congress rallied strongly behind Trump, with some describing the operation as having changed the course of history, a genuinely bold characterization for a single raid, even one that removed a sitting head of state from power. Venezuela's own government, or what remained of its official communications apparatus in the immediate aftermath, issued a statement condemning what it called the grave military aggression perpetrated by the United States, language that positioned the operation as an outright violation of Venezuelan sovereignty, rather than a legitimate counter-narcotics or counter-terrorism action. Internationally, reactions split in exactly the way you'd expect for an operation this unprecedented, championed by some governments as a bold strike against a narco-terrorist regime, condemned by others as a dangerous, destabilizing precedent, a sitting head of state captured by foreign special forces and flown to another country to stand trial, regardless of what charges that individual may have actually been facing. There's a useful historical comparison worth drawing here too, because operations to seize sitting or former foreign leaders through military force have happened before, but rarely with this exact combination of speed, precision, and subsequent legal follow-through. The capture of Panama's Manuel Noriega in 1989 stands as perhaps the closest historical parallel, another instance of American forces removing a head of state accused of drug trafficking and bringing him to face trial in an American courtroom. But even that operation involved a much larger, more prolonged military commitment, an actual invasion rather than a single tightly bounded overnight raid completed in under 3 hours. Operation Absolute Resolve's remarkably compressed timeline, from initial strikes to a fully secured target and a safe extraction in roughly 2.5 hours, reflects just how much more precise and how much faster modern special operations capability has become in the decades since, even while pursuing an objective with genuinely similar historical roots. That precedent question deserves genuinely serious consideration because whatever you think about Maduro's own record and the specific narcotics terrorism charges against him, this operation established something that goes well beyond just Venezuela's specific situation. Capturing a sitting foreign head of state through a military raid and extraditing him to face charges in a domestic American courtroom is an extraordinarily rare event in modern history, one with implications that extend to how every other government facing this kind of American terrorist designation might now have to think about its own security posture and its own relationship with Washington going forward. If a formal terrorist designation can trigger this kind of operation against a country's actual sitting leader, that reshapes the calculus for any government anywhere in the world that finds itself on the receiving end of a similar designation in the future, whether or not that specific government's leadership actually engages in anything resembling the drug trafficking allegations at the center of Maduro's own case. That broader implication became a lot clearer once you look at what followed Operation Absolute Resolve over the following months, because this specific mission turned out to be the opening move in a much larger, more explicit strategic doctrine rather than a one-off, isolated event. The Trump administration's own May 2026 counterterrorism strategy. The document referenced Maduro's capture directly and prominently, describing it as an example of the armed forces demonstrating what it called incredible power and skill by capturing the narco-terrorist outlaw Venezuelan dictator and bringing him to face American justice. That same strategy document explicitly framed the operation as validating what it called the Trump corollary, described as a blueprint for a modern Monroe Doctrine, drawing an explicit historical line back to the original 19th century American foreign policy principle that asserted the United States would resist outside interference anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, except now repurposed into a framework justifying direct American military action against foreign leaders and organizations designated as terrorist threats, whether those threats came from drug cartels, jihadist networks, or the governments that the administration argued were providing them safe harbor. And that doctrine didn't stay purely theoretical. It kept showing up again in operation after operation across the months that followed. In May, American and Nigerian forces carried out a joint operation that killed Abu Bilal al-Minuki, described by Trump as ISIS's second-in-command globally, in a raid Trump characterized as a meticulously planned and very complex mission targeting what he called the most active terrorist in the world, though independent analysts covering the region noted that characterization of al-Minuki's actual rank within ISIS's global structure appeared to be somewhat overstated compared to more grounded assessments from groups that track militant organizations closely. In June, Trump announced that a swift and lethal kinetic American strike had killed the leader of the Tren de Aragua gang, an organization the United States had similarly designated as a terrorist group, directly continuing the same basic pattern established back in January, identifying a target, formally designating the organization or individual as a terrorist threat, and then authorizing direct kinetic action against that target regardless of where in the world they happen to be operating. And separately, an alleged Iranian proxy terrorist named Mohammed al-Sadi was arrested in Turkey and extradited to New York, accused of firebombing, stabbing, and allegedly plotting to target Ivanka Trump for assassination, another example of exactly the same overall pattern. American pressure combined with foreign partner cooperation to apprehend and extradite terrorism suspects, rather than relying purely on conventional diplomatic or law enforcement channels alone. Looking at that full sequence together, the January raid on Caracas, the May operation in Nigeria, the June strike on the Tren de Aragua leader, the Turkish extradition of an alleged Iranian proxy operative, a clear and consistent operational pattern emerges, one explicitly documented and celebrated in the administration's own counterterrorism strategy paper. Identify a target through a formal terrorist designation, whatever the underlying justification for that designation happens to be, drug trafficking, jihadist affiliation, proxy connections to a hostile foreign government, and then pursue that target using the full weight of American military, intelligence, and diplomatic capability, regardless of that target's formal position or status, up to and including the sitting head of an entire sovereign nation. Operation Absolute Resolve wasn't simply a dramatic, one-time news event. It was the opening demonstration of exactly how far this administration was willing to go in pursuing that specific strategy. And every subsequent operation across the following months has only reinforced just how central that approach has become to the broader Trump counterterrorism doctrine. What makes this operation worth understanding in this much technical and strategic detail rather than just the dramatic headline of a dictator getting captured overnight, is that it represents a genuinely significant shift in how the United States is willing to project power against individuals and governments it designates as terrorist threats. The sheer scale of resources committed, 150 aircraft, 20 launch sites, months of patient CIA tradecraft, 200 special operations personnel, all aimed at capturing a single individual, tells you just how seriously this administration takes the strategic value of these kinds of high-profile decapitation operations, both for their immediate tactical effect and for the broader deterrent message they send to every other government or organization that might eventually find itself facing a similar American terrorist designation. And the surgical, deliberately restrained nature of the actual strikes themselves, concentrated damage at Fort Tiuna rather than broad, indiscriminate bombing, reflects a level of military precision and discipline that stands in genuine contrast to how a less carefully planned operation of this scale and ambition might easily have unfolded instead. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Do you think Operation Absolute Resolve represents a legitimate, justified use of American military power against a genuinely corrupt narco-terrorist regime, one that had already been formally indicted on serious charges years before the actual raid took place? Or do you think capturing a sitting head of state through a military operation and extraditing him to face trial in a domestic American courtroom sets a genuinely dangerous precedent, regardless of the specific merits of the charges against Maduro himself? And given how directly this operation has since been cited and celebrated as the founding example of a broader Trump corollary doctrine, one that's already been applied against targets in Nigeria, against a Venezuelan gang leader, and against an alleged Iranian proxy operative in Turkey, do you think that pattern represents a coherent, effective new approach to combating transnational terrorism and organized crime? Or do you think it risks normalizing exactly the kind of extraterritorial military action that could eventually be turned against governments with far less clear-cut justification than the case against Maduro actually provided? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear how people are weighing the operational brilliance of this specific mission against its much broader geopolitical implications, because there's a real, substantive argument on more than one side of this. And it's exactly the kind of question where admiration for the military execution and genuine concern about the precedent can both be entirely valid at the same time. If this breakdown helped you understand the full scope of what actually happened that night in Caracas, and everything that's followed from it since, share it with someone trying to follow this story closely, and subscribe if you want to keep tracking how this doctrine continues to unfold, because based on everything that's happened since January, this is very unlikely to be the last operation of exactly this kind. There's a final point worth making about why understanding this specific operation in this much depth actually matters, beyond just satisfying curiosity about how a single dramatic raid unfolded. Operation Absolute Resolve functioned as a proof of concept for an entire new doctrine of American power projection, one explicitly built around identifying terrorist threats through formal designation, and then pursuing those threats with the full weight of American military and intelligence capability, regardless of rank, title, or sovereign status. Every government around the world capable of drawing that same conclusion from watching what happened to Maduro now has to factor that possibility into its own calculations, and every subsequent operation carried out under this same broad doctrine. In Nigeria, against a Venezuelan gang leader, against an alleged Iranian proxy operative in Turkey, only reinforces just how seriously this administration intends to keep applying that same basic template going forward. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back the moment there's real movement to report.